morning. Thank you for joining me for another Coffee and Concepts. As you know, what I attempt to do with these morning reflections is take a theoretical idea and give it some practical value so that you can take it away and hopefully it will help benefit your life. So what I want to do this morning is talk about the signifier and the signified, and why in psychoanalysis the analyst is so interested not in what you mean but in what you say, and how this can help us understand our desires, can help us understand why we get caught up in compulsive repetitions, and how we might be able to free ourselves and have a kind of wider experience of life, a wider set of enjoyments, a wider kind of affirmation of our existence. Okay, so this is very counterintuitive at first. I've struggled often with really trying to understand why the signifier, which is, and I'll define what that is in a second, but why the signifier has a greater value than the signified in psychoanalytic work. So signifier and signified, these are terms from linguistics. The signifier, in a nutshell, is a sound or a marking on a page. And then the signified is what that signifier means, the concept. So the word tree, the tree is the signifier, and the concept that you think about when you hear that word, that is the signified. So whenever we speak, we have signifiers, right? We have language, and we have concepts that come up in each other's minds as we speak. And those are the signifieds. And in everyday life, what is most important is the signified, right? Whenever you're talking with somebody, what you want to get across is your intended meaning, your signified. If you say something and the words are not chosen well, and a person misunderstands you, you go, I didn't mean that, right? I can understand why you thought that with the words I used, but I was using words in a poor way. What I really meant to say was this. Or in the very well-known example of the Freudian slip, you say something like, oh, I'm so annoyed at my mother, sorry, my sister, right? And you said mother, so the signifier was mother, but the signified, what you were thinking of was your sister. And in normal everyday life, what's important to us is not the signifier, but the signified. So as I say, if I'm having a conversation with you and I say, I'm so annoyed with my mum, actually, sorry, my sister, in that conversation, am interested in why you're annoyed with your sister. I kind of don't pay attention to the fact that you said your mother. But in psychoanalysis, you take a real interest in the former, not what you intended to say, but what you did say. So there's a form of literalism in analysis, right? You're looking at the text, what is said, not what is simply meant. Why is that important? Okay, going to use lots of examples. But first of all, before I do, I'll say that as an infant, you start off surrounded by swimming in language, signifiers, right? So think about a pet dog as a good example, because a dog is surrounded by signifiers. People are always speaking to their pets, but the animal has a very serious difficulty in understanding what is signified by the signifiers. So a dog might be looking at you, they kind of know something's being communicated, but they might not have a clear idea what's being communicated, right? So they become kind of neurotic. In a sense, we neuroticize our pets. But an infant is similar, right? They're surrounded by language, but they don't yet know what it means. And there's a certain point at which they are kind of like bringing into their mind signifiers before signification. So signifiers, even in terms of our history, come before signifieds. And as the kid grows, they start to put a signified to the signifier. And that's why children often have very funny speech, because the speech is disconnected from signifiers. So they can talk about, well, I don't know, there's loads of examples, can't think of any. But if you've got kids, I'm sure you know lots of examples of this where there's just not a great connection between the signifier and the signified. And the child is beginning to work out how to use language. So signifiers come first and then signifieds. And from this Lacanian perspective, uh, the language begins whenever these signifiers are etched into our mind. They're recorded, right? So these signifiers start to be recorded somehow in our mind. So before that happens, this might be a mythological period, but there is an infant who's looking out at the world, but there's nothing being recorded. Being like Leon Brenner talks about, it's almost like a camera, where if you imagine an infant being like the lens, the light is going into the lens, but if there's no film in the camera, nothing's being recorded. But whenever the mind is at a certain stage in development, what comes in is recorded on the film. So the mind is like a film on which language signifiers begin to be recorded, begin to be marked, very primal signifiers. Um, and then say these gain meaning. Now, what this means, interestingly, is that, and this is called a master signifier. So I'll define that in a second. A master signifier, but is a kind of primal signifier that marks who you are, that is an anchoring point in your life. And so this early master signifier that is imprinted in your mind as an infant becomes a kind of north star by which you navigate your entire life. Now, this is interesting because on one side, you have kind of like a supernatural belief that there's a soul, there's a true, authentic self that has authentic desires, right? And a lot of life is about saying, well, I think I like this, and people told me I like that, but I'm trying to find my authentic self, trying to speak, so as I'm not so influenced by society and by the people around me that I can really get to who I really am in my essence. So there's that idea. And then there's the other idea at the other side, which is, there is no essence. We learn what to desire through society, who we hang out with, and it chops and it changes over time. There's nothing essential, right? Well, interestingly, while the latter sounds more reasonable, right? So you start off thinking there's an essential soul, and then you go, oh, no, we're products of our society and our language and what we've read. The issue is, well, why is it then that I have such a stable sense of self? Now, not if you're psychotic, whatever, but most of us have a certain stability in our sense of selves. Where does that come from? We have a stable sense of self, and yet also we do change over time and we are influenced by people. So how do we make sense of that? Well, in, again, psychoanalytic theory, it's the signifier. So what you have is you have a certain signifier or set of signifiers that mark you, but their meaning can change over time and does change over time. But the meaning can get very rigid and very stuck, and sometimes the meaning can be so loose and fluid that it flies off. So a friend of mine was literally at Tesco, this grocery store, yesterday, and she got talking to a guy who was obviously kind of psychotic, and they got talking. He said, "Oh, you look like my yoga teacher." And then they got talking about yoga, and then started talking about how yoga was invented in Ireland, and then he started talking about how the Irish went to India, and then how the Irish can't breed with Indians because it doesn't work, and basically what happened is this guy just started talking, and all of this stuff was said, loads of it was said, and it all made grammatical sense. But it seemed like nonsense. It seemed like it was divorced from any kind of grounding signifier. It just kind of seemed to go everywhere. So that's whenever there's like things are so loose, right? But most of the time, there is a relationship between the signified and the signifier, a certain relationship called the quilting point in analysis. They link together. Um, Now, okay, so a master signifier is like the word God or freedom or justice. These are master signifiers in society where you can't quite define what it is, but it's the word that defines everything. So somebody might be a patriot and they talk about nation. And actually defining what nation is it's always fluid, it's defined, but there's always a dimension of it that can't be touched upon. But it's the word that seems to hold them together in terms of their political views, or whatever political view you've got, there'll be like a master signifier for say freedom, democracy, justice, nation, whatever it is. Um, and what can happen is over time you can change how you interpret that very radically so that you can talk about nation and yet move from, say, the right to the left or from the left to the right, and yet that term still uh, anchors you. It's like a piece of art. If you think of a piece of art like a signifier, it doesn't change, but how you interpret the art can and does change over time, and there's a variety of interpretations about the art. So the signified changes, but the signifier remains the same. Parables are the same. Parable is like a signifier. The parable remains the same, but it can be interpreted and reinterpreted and reinvested with meaning in all sorts of ways over time, right? So the parable stays the same, the signifier stays the same, but the signified changes and develops and moves. I think a really important example of this is in religion. So we take Christianity. Um, Christianity, what kind of makes Christianity a tradition is a certain set of signifiers. These include things like grace, forgiveness, crucifixion, resurrection, original sin, uh, 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 what's the word for predestination, all of these terms, right? Now, over time, I can't remember who it was who said it, I think it was maybe Paul Tillich, but a reformation in Christianity is not when the signifiers change, but when the signified changes. So original sin stays as a signifier, but it gets reinvested with different meaning, very radically different meaning. Same with crucifixion, resurrection, grace, forgiveness, conversion. These terms. So weirdly, what holds Christianity together as a tradition is not the signifieds, but the signifiers. And interestingly, like progressives, it's the other way around. So progressivism is a kind of like a common sense thing where they want to get rid of some of the signifiers to get to the correct signified, right? So in other words, what Christianity is a set of signifieds. It's a concrete set of beliefs and practices in terms of politics and all of that. And what can change is the signifieds. They can change. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, no. The If you get rid of the signifiers, you get rid of Christianity, right? It becomes something else that's not good or bad, or really, but when you get rid of the signifiers, you get rid of the religion itself. And in the same way in psychoanalysis is we have certain signifieds within us. If you got rid of those signifieds, you get rid of the self. You become something completely different, right? The signifieds is where the stability is, and the signified. So the signifier is where the stability is. The signified is where there is wiggle room and change and transformation. So to use an example, if you grew up with a kind of signifier of freedom, something about your parents that before you could even understand it, there was this notion of to be free, right? And you take that on board, and as you grow up, you find yourself, let's say, when you get into relationships, you never stay within them. You always find yourself feeling trapped and end up sabotaging them. In terms of work, it's the same thing. You can never stick with the same job. You're always moving around. And also in terms of where you live, you're always traveling and moving to other locations. And so this is part of who you are. These are different ways in which you can signify the signifier freedom. So freedom is locked within you, and it's interpreted in various different, completely different areas of your life. Freedom is freedom in relationship, freedom in work, freedom to travel. Freedom is this signifier that links together all these seemingly disparate parts of your life. And we don't know our signifiers. A lot of psychoanalysis is about spending a lot of time trying to figure out what this kind of nodal point, what this signifier is. And then that allows you to make all these connections in your life. And the idea is not to change the signifier, but to open yourself up to different ways of giving signification to it, giving meaning to it. So perhaps you might go, well, I can have freedom in work, right? How could I understand, or how could I find a job where I feel freedom, but I can also have a certain continuity, because changing jobs all the time means that I don't have money, and it makes it stressful in terms of paying the rent, etc., etc. So you find a way to open up freedom. You don't get rid of freedom as your master signifier, but over and through analysis, you might get less stuck in how that signifier is signified, how it's understood. Again, coming back to the example of the artwork, you're maybe stuck with one interpretation of the artwork. And what you do through maybe going to art class is you start to learn, and listening to other people, is you start to learn that you can interpret the art in different ways. You still love the art, this, say, particular piece of art that you really love, that really speaks to you, that stays the same, but your aperture for interpreting it and understanding it begins to change. So again, this is the analytic idea rather than other forms, say narrative theology or whatever, where this signified is what important. Here is the signifier is what is important. And in terms of someone like Slavoj Žižek, what he's saying in terms of political change is, if you can shift the signifiers within a society, you can get rid of the system itself. The system, how the system runs is through a master signifier, and when you get rid of the master signifier, you get rid of the system, right? When it comes to a subject, you can't kind of get rid of the master signifier. The point is to interpret it and reinterpret it in wider and different ways. And as I say, in terms of religion, say Christianity, Christianity is held together by a set of signifiers. God is one of them. I say grace, forgiveness, crucifixion, resurrection. These various even Eucharist, whatever it is. These signifiers that change meaning. So a reformation is whenever these are all radically reinterpreted, something new and enlivening erupts, because this signifies the meaning that these terms have becomes dead and becomes oppressive and becomes constrictive. Someone comes along, provides a fresh way of understanding these terms that existentially speak to us, that are enlivening. And we are joined together with the others in the tradition, not by the shared signifieds, but by the shared signifiers. Okay, so why is this all practically useful? I guess because when you start to think of yourself not as having this essential set of authentic, desires and meaning that you can somehow get to, nor, we're just sociologically kind of like influenced by society, and who we are is completely dictated by our environment, and we've got no sense of self. There's no sense of Peter Rollins. There's no sense of you, right? This allows for you to bring these two together. There is something that makes you you, and it's a signifier. It's a certain thing that is anchored within you that allows you to corral your world into a meaningful system. However, suffering often comes when that meaning, the signified, is so tight and so restrictive that um, you you're stuck. And so, in a way, coming to know what this master signifier is for you, this cluster of signifiers that's foundational, what that is for you, uh, you can potentially widen out your interpretation, find freedom from that restrictive nature. Now, in something like psychotic structures, there has been a failure at instigating a master signifier, right? So, what you have to do is you have to find an artificial one, a prosthetic, and that'll take us off in a different direction. So, I won't talk about that now, but we all kind of need a master signifier, whether it was instantiated in us or whether we have to, in a way, artificially create one. This is what conspiracy theories are. That's why conspiracy theories and psychosis are very connected, because it's almost like you have like a master signifier. There is a group that's controlling everything, that is seen everywhere and nowhere, but this is a foundational group that control everything. So it corrals your entire experience of the world. Say a Jewish, elite who are hidden behind everything and control all of the world's media and even control the weather and stuff like that. The this master signifier is artificial, and it helps you make sense of the world which otherwise falls apart. So when you're talking to someone who's a real conspiracy theorist, like as in it's holding them together, you have to understand that that is something they need in order for their world not to fragment entirely. And the idea potentially is to find a healthier and better kind of master signifier. But for most of us, this is already within us. It's not something we choose, it's there. And coming to know, oh, it's something about freedom or lack of restriction, or something to do with justice, or something to do with being good, something to do with being honest, with always doing the right thing. Whatever it is, that there's a certain thing that is anchored everything you do in your work and your family life and your relationships, that potentially has become, as I say, too rigid in terms of what it means. And coming to ask yourself, what is that signifier in my life? That can be very helpful to kind of free you up. It also helps you understand why there's a continuity between the past you and the present you. Something that joins you to your childhood and will join you to your whenever you're elderly. There is something there, but it's not, as I say, some authentic meaning that you have to find. It's a type of work of art, a type of signifier that can be interpreted and reinterpreted in new ways. Okay, I hope that makes some sense, because this is it's a very basic notion. By basic, I don't mean simple, but kind of like almost like a foundational concept in a certain form of psychoanalytic thinking, right? It's foundational, and yet it's very hard to kind of get your head around as to why the analyst cares more about what you say than what you mean. Because what they're looking for is that word that kind of like is a nodal point that connects all these disparate parts of your life. That it does have meaning, but the point is that meaning is shifting, is changing, or often isn't. That's the problem, right? But it can shift, it can change. But the signifier itself remains rooted, it remains the same. Somehow in the brain there is an etching, a marking, and that kind of sticks. Okay, there you go. Hope that was that was a very high concept thing, but again, I hope for some of you who are interested in this work, it'll help you understand what is meant by the signifier, and in particular in terms of theology, which is my way of understanding it, is like, oh yeah, what Christianity is not a signified. That changes over time, but a set of signifiers that are so powerful, so rich, that they seem to be able to be interpreted and reinterpreted and invested in meaning and new meaning. Not constantly, but let's say every about 500 years or so, they can kind of get a new set of meanings. And the work of parotheology is to give these terms new sets of meanings, new signifieds, That's why I keep words like original sin, right? And invest it as original lack, and a sense of like there is an ontological basic sense of asymmetry within us, and that's what original sin means. So what I've done is I'm continuity with the tradition, but there is an interpretation that is, I think, faithful to the term, but adds something to it. All right, have a great day. Bye bye.